And it's now my immense pleasure to introduce Emily Segal, who also has many parallel realities as an artist, writer, and strategist. We met actually when Emily still had her K-Hole group. She is now the co-founder of a new group called NEMESIS Global, based in Berlin. And K-Hole basically wrote these trend forecasting reports, which, as opposed to many other trend forecasting reports, were free. You can just download them, so they're all online. All of you can download them as PDFs. And when we invited Emily for the first time to lecture at the Serpentine, it was in the context of a marathon, the 89 Plus Marathon. She introduced the concept of normcore, and it's a couple of weeks later that suddenly we got hundreds, thousands of alerts online, and this notion went viral. It's today part of the English Dictionary Word of the Year, and it's basically become part of the language. So also Emily invents neologism, and she always says, and that of course connects to this attempt to make a portraiture of the countryside. Emily always says branding is also a form of portrait. She's working on an essay right now, which will turn into a novel. A very warm welcome to Emily Segal.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all so much for having me. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between the countryside and future, and futurism, and using the countryside as a model for futurism. So it's a little bit connected to some of the mysticism that was brought up yesterday, but maybe in a little bit of a different inflection. Thinking about it this way began for me, hold on, first I must find my magic wand. Thinking about the countryside began for me really with falling asleep in the car as a child. To me, the countryside was a place where I woke up, and it was dark fields rising up around me as I sort of fell asleep and woke back up again as a child. And that's my most primordial memory of the countryside. And the state of hypnagogia is the state between waking and dreaming that we experience very often. It's a time of heightened suggestibility, illogic, fluid association of ideas, what the psychoanalyst Herbert Silber called autosymbolism, where concepts are sort of turned immediately into images. And while that might sound very mystical and quite wild, it's actually something that all of us experience almost every day. It's also the zone in which one has what's called scientifically the Tetris effect. If you've ever spent the day in the ocean and then while falling asleep felt that motion coming back over and over, that's called the Tetris effect. Also, if you play Tetris or video games and you see it reflected in the theater of your mind as you're falling asleep, that's also the Tetris effect. So this idea of hypnagogic scroll is my way of connecting that to the digital and also maybe to the landscape. As the document metaphor breaks down, now we have these sort of infinite pages and infinite feeds that we look at that sort of are between light and dark, between wakefulness and secrecy, and the landscape also rolls on in a similar way. So what we're talking about here with the countryside is sort of the theater of the mind. It's what we see when we read, and it's what we're imagining behind our eyes. I think the countryside, insofar as we've been talking about it during this weekend and also today on the panel, is imaginary. It's a literary space, and other speakers have brought this up. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the countryside is not exactly the rural, and it definitely isn't everything that's not urban, because I would argue that the desert is not the countryside, and I don't think that the jungle or the rainforest is the countryside. And many rural environments, to me, lack the coherence that would make the term countryside really pop as an accurate description. So the countryside is sort of a dream of coherence. It's a false coherence projected on a very real landscape. And to use Rem's phrase about thinning out, I think that that's crucial to understanding the countryside. And to me, again, it becomes a metaphor of light and dark. To me, the countryside is where the lights thin out. So thinning can also be a dimming. In 2009, the science fiction writer Bruce Sterling coined the term dark euphoria to describe the coming decade, and that's the decade that more or less we've just lived through. Dark euphoria is what the 20-teens feel like. Things are just falling apart. You can't believe the possibilities. It's like anything is possible, but you never realize you're going to have to dread it so much. It's like a leap into the unknown. You're falling toward Earth at 900 kilometers an hour, and then you realize there's no Earth there. That's a dark euphoria feeling. So I'm today looking a little bit at how that darkness might be updated for where we are now. K-Hole, my group that I worked with for 5 years in New York, that sort of disbanded into a set of different projects over the last couple of years, was once asked to define the future by a magazine. This is the type of thing that's often asked of you if you're a trend forecaster. And someone asked us, where is the future? Where is it going to happen? And of course, we knew that this was a trick question. So much of the work of being a trend forecaster or a strategist for brands is being one who can answer trick questions on the spot. And we said, the future is in the fog. Of course, that was a vagueness that was intended to point out a sort of ambivalent relationship to our own discipline, ambivalence being there, not a sort of confusion, but really contradictory feelings. We, like so many of our clients, listeners, readers, wanted to know the future and wanted to be able to project it with certainty. And of course, as we did it, we knew that it was almost always completely false. It was more a dream or a gesture of an emergent reality. I like to think about what the great filmmaker, writer, tarot reader, and mystic Alejandro Jodorowsky says about the tarot and about reading tarot cards as a way of predicting the future. He says, you must not talk about the future. The future is a con. The tarot is a language that talks about the present. If you use it to see the future, you become a con man. You are just a charlatan. Nothing is a matter of probability. If you set your spirit to something, that phenomenon will happen. When you are determined, when you deeply enter the dimension that I call the dance of reality, the world dances around you and gives you what you seek. So I'm going to switch now to a different type of semi-mystical reality. The novel The Left Hand of Darkness by the science fiction and really fantasy writer Ursula K, who sadly passed away last week at the age of 88 after giving us 20 novels and many, many other amazing books. And in The Left Hand of Darkness, she has this line that I adore coming from the protagonist, talking about one of those admirable professional prophecies applicable to any outcome. The Left Hand of Darkness features an emissary from a league of planets to a new planet called Winter, where it's very cold and snowy like it is here in the Engadine, to convince them to join this group of planets. And what's interesting is that the protagonist is somewhat similar to a human male, but the people on the planet where he visits are what can be called ambisexual. They only take on a fixed gender at a certain time of the month, and only when they're sort of sexually aroused, and the rest of the time they're sort of in between genders. And so this novel plays out a situation in which a more or less human male has to do politics in this very tricky situation on a planet with no gender. And he's extremely concerned about whether or not his mission will come true, if it will work out, if he'll be able to convince the people on this planet to join the League of Nations, which is his great mission. And to find out more, he has to leave the city and go into the countryside to encounter a group of foretellers who are a group of people who, through a sort of mystical process that he doesn't understand, are capable of finding the answer to almost any question. So he's on this ultra cold planet, and he's going up super steep, almost Himalayan-style mountains through snowdrifts where it's 40 degrees in the sun and -5 degrees in the shade, this incredibly extreme winter environment. And then he finds himself in the countryside where the coherence of the city breaks down. And this chapter is called The Domestication of Hunch. So he arrives, and the people there are practicing something called a discipline of presence and untrance, a sort of form of self-loss. And like many other things in Le Guin's book, this is sort of similar to Taoism. And the protagonist there is thinking, legends of prediction are common throughout the whole household of man. Gods speak, spirits speak, computers speak. oracular ambiguity or statistical probability provides loopholes, and discrepancies are expunged by faith. So he goes along the path into the forest, all random as it was, full of trees, and he meets the foretellers. And he sees this group of people, and at the center of them is the weaver, the one who keeps tensions and responses of the group running in a self-augmenting pattern until the strain breaks the pattern and you reach through to the answer. What happens reading the future in the countryside is something quite different than giving an official, considered forecast of what might happen. It's actually, he says, don't you see why we perfected and practice foretelling? And the protagonist said, no. And the answer is to exhibit the perfect uselessness of knowing the answer to the wrong question. So now I'm going to switch to yet another text, something completely different. It was one of the first things that I read when I started learning about and researching futurism when I was very young, 21 or 22. I came across a text called the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto. And I was extremely excited because it featured another literary character near and dear to my heart, the character Case Pollard from William Gibson's 2001 novel Pattern Recognition, who is a cool hunter and sort of trend forecaster in her own right, whose incredible powers of understanding and reading corporate logos are connected directly to a crippling anxiety. If she ever sees the Michelin Man or certain other corporate logos, she almost has to go to a mental institution. There's a deep, deep fear of corporate logos that also powers her enormous abilities to read into sort of the future of business. And the literary theorist Lauren Berlant, quoted in the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto, calls her an empress of the amygdala being the part of the brain that processes fear. So this is the idea of the trend forecaster, someone who goes out into the wilderness, is sort of processing information through fear. Also from the Gonzo Futurist Manifesto, I was introduced to another very interesting text called Welcome to the Future Nauseous. So in that text, the writer is critiquing the idea of future shock, this Alvin Toffler concept that when the future comes, we're all going to be jolted, that our reality as we know it is accelerating at such a pace that our minds can't keep up. This is when we hear about information overload. This is actually quite an old idea that's being recycled over and over again. But the idea that there's so much information coming at us through so many new channels in so many new environments that we're bound to break down is being taken to task in this text and saying, actually, that's total bullshit. What happens is that we live in a normalcy field, and the most successful new products or new experiences are ones that are actually quite similar to ones that we know already, but just stretch it a little bit in a certain dimension to sort of encapsulate the future in almost a blob-like way. This blob sucks in or stretches to accommodate the future. So we don't need to worry about acceleration. We need to worry about the field expanding to a breaking point and popping like an overinflated balloon. We don't need to worry about computers getting faster. We need to worry about the document metaphor breaking suddenly, leaving us unable to comprehend the internet. There's one element of the future that does arrive on schedule, uncensored. It's the emotional quality. The pace of change is accelerating, and we experience this as a field-stretching anxiety. We cannot separate future anxiety from other forms of anxiety. Are you upset today because your boss yelled at you? Or because subtle cues made the accelerating pace of change leak into your life as a tear in the field? I think what I learned from looking at these different models of the future, both from Le Guin's book and these other texts that I've just mentioned, the sort of foretelling that I encountered in the wilderness and countryside of this late 60s book, is that the future will reach us as a certain form of nausea, but maybe not a physical kind. It has to do with this manufactured normalcy field deforming, and it becomes an affect. It will reach us as a feeling, as a sensation, as something we experience in the dark, not necessarily something that we see, not necessarily something that we read, perhaps inside a building with no windows, perhaps inside a building that's bigger than some towns or villages. So as we approach or already experience the collapse of consensus reality, I think this is really important. The dark future is not necessarily a euphoric or exuberant one, as Bruce Sterling mentioned, just as the countryside is not necessarily a safe or happy place. It's a place of danger, lack of visibility, loneliness, a place where women have been put to work. But really, the dimness of the lights there show us that we should embrace a future that's based on unknowing and reversal. We should take on the repose of the hangman in tarot, who's upside down as the future comes toward him. Thank you.